Hello and welcome back to Paleocast. My name is Dave Marshall and you're listening to episode 133, Drawing and Painting Dinosaurs with Paleoartist Dr Emily Willoughby. First of all, Happy New Year to all our listeners. I hope you had a great holiday and that 2022 has already started out better than 2021. I had a very interesting time being sent off to an oil rig offshore of Norway shortly before Christmas. But then the job was cancelled and I get home on Christmas Eve, getting to spend the next few days home alone, in quarantine, no food and no presents. However, one good thing that happened over this time was that we passed 1 million downloads, which more than made up for my rubbish Christmas, so thanks to everyone that's listened over the past decade, and hopefully the next million downloads will come much quicker. For this episode, we're going to be discussing everything to do with drawing and painting dinosaurs, to coincide with the launch of Emily's new book, Drawing and Painting Dinosaurs. We've even got a copy to give away, which we will do this time by running a micro competition to draw or paint a dinosaur. So give yourself 1 minute and not a second longer, then post your entry as a comment or as a reply to our post announcing this episode on either Facebook or Twitter. Then I'll choose an entry at random just before our next episode and announce the winner there. For our backers on Patreon, at the Silurian level or above, we have our first lecture on how animals fossilise available to watch now. And for those of you who want to access that, please consider becoming a patron and helping to support the show. Then, as always, we'll have images to accompany this episode on our website, and all the likes, shares, comments, and subscribes we get will all be greatly appreciated. I hope you enjoy this episode. Hi Emily, thanks so much for coming on the show today. We always like to get to know our guest a bit before we jump straight into the interview. So I always like to know where you've come from. So can you give us an overview of your academic background, please?
Yeah, sure. So I'm currently a postdoc working in behavior genetics at the University of Minnesota. I got my PhD January of this year, so I've had it for about a year now. And
congratulations.
Oh, thank you. And I do most of my research involves psychometrics, personality, and behavior genetics, and related topics.
Yeah, I don't know any related topics. This is all new to me because I've pretty much only ever interviewed paleontologists. So can you unpack some of that? Sorry, what kind of things do you research and what does it involve? What kind of questions are you asking?
Yeah, absolutely. So behavior genetics is considered kind of a subfield of psychology. And so I don't do any like clinical psychology type stuff. It's not that. It's more research and experimental cognitive psychology. So the kind of questions that we're interested in are things like why are people different from one another on various, measurable traits that we call phenotypes. So personality questionnaires can be used to assess like big five personality, like, openness to experience, neuroticism, extroversion, so on. But I'm most interested in studying human intelligence from kind of a cognitive psychology and genetic perspective. So why, what factors of the environment and genetics tend to make people different from one another in measured psychometric intelligence, executive function, reaction time on simple laboratory tasks, and that kind of thing, broadly construed.
Without trying to go down a rabbit hole, what kinds of factors control that? I just have no idea where to even begin.
Right. Well, in behavior genetics, we often use genetically sensitive samples to take these measurements. And what that means is we get samples of individuals who are related to one another in predictable ways that can be quantified mathematically. So sometimes that just involves family studies where we know that pairs of siblings share 50% of their They're variable DNA with one another, and parents and offspring also share 50%. So we can use siblings, normal siblings like that. We can use parent-offspring pairs, and we can also use identical twins, which is one of the most common and useful types of sample to study in behavior genetic psychology. So identical twins share absolutely 100% of their DNA with one another. So if we get, like, say, 1,000 pairs of identical twins and we measure them all on some, cognitive capacity, like reaction time, and we see that the monozygotic or identical twins differ from one another significantly in their reaction time, the conclusion from that would be that there are environmental factors that are influencing that trait. On the other hand, if we find that the monozygotic twins are much more similar to each other on reaction time than our fraternal or regular siblings, then we conclude that while environment still might play a smaller role, the dominant role in that case is genetics in reaction time, or whatever the phenotype is. We also often use adoption samples where the children, at least one child in a family unit, is totally unrelated to their parents or their sibling. And in that case, we can kind of do the opposite logic where, if adoptive siblings are very similar to one another on some trait of interest, but are not related genetically at all, then we can conclude that something about their upbringing is primarily responsible. So for an example, I recently published a paper in Psychological Science about political ideology and religiosity and other kind of social traits like that. And we have an adoption sample where all of the adoptive offspring are now in their 30s or 40s. So they don't live with their parents anymore. They have their own lives. But we also have parent measurements on all of these political and social traits. And what we find is that on quite a few of these traits, the adult adoptive siblings are actually quite similar to their parents in religiosity and political beliefs and so on, which indicates that there is something about their upbringing that kind of embedded certain traits that they've grown up with, and so that can give us a good sense of the etiology of some of these cognitive and attitudes and other such measurements.
Well, I guess it would be more surprising if it was the other way around and I had the gene for being conservative.
Well, another thing we know from genetics is that when traits are heritable, complex human traits like intelligence or attitudes or personality, they're usually being affected by thousands of genetic variants of very small effect. And so that's what we do in genome-wide association studies. We get millions of people, genotype them all, and then see if any of their genetic variants have kind of an outsized association with the trait of interest. And whenever we do that, we find that there are a huge number of genetic variants that all have a very small effect, but in aggregate, together, they all have a reasonably large effect.
Well, it's absolutely fascinating, but unfortunately, it's not what we're going to be talking about today. Do you have any kind of interviews or articles or something that if anyone is interested in this, they can follow up on this kind of work?
Yeah, from just my website, emilywilloughby.com, you can click on the research button on that page, and you can see all of the stuff that I do pretty much, including links to all of my publications and some of my side projects. And I also do illustrations for my behavior genetic work sometimes. So I kind of get to combine my two fields of interest somewhat, at least.
Yep. And it's the illustrations that we're going to be talking about today. So you're an incredibly well recognized and talented paleo artist. So, given that we've just had an introduction to your academic side of things, is the paleo art just a side project? And how did your interest in this whole field develop?
Well, I've been interested in paleontology and paleo art long before I started to pursue my PhD in behavior genetics. So I don't really consider it a side project. It's kind of more like it's almost, I would say, equal in importance to me as my academic work. So I try as hard as I can to kind of do them both. So sometimes this involves putting aside one area for a little while I work on something that's time sensitive for the other. But I often strive to just try to work on both areas like pretty much every day. So yeah, my interest in the field of paleo art developed. Well, all kids are into dinosaurs pretty much, most kids, and I love to draw since I was old enough to hold a pencil, pretty much, or a crayon. And so I drew dinosaurs just like every other little kid. But the specific thing that turned it into like a major focus of my life was due to some of the really astounding feathered dinosaur fossils that came out of China, primarily in the late 1990s and early 2000s, such as Sinornithosaurus and Microraptor, especially. When I first saw pictures of these fossils in National Geographic or whatever, it was like, oh my gosh, these things, they look like birds. It's amazing. I didn't really realize that. And that was when I was in high school, I guess. And at the time, my primary academic interest was all things evolution. And so seeing this really clear and elegant and really quite beautiful example of the evolution of feathers and flight and the connection between birds and dinosaurs, it kind of just instilled this sort of obsession with wanting to draw these animals and have them look as realistic as possible. So that's kind of how the whole thing developed.
Do you have a formal background in art, or is it just something that you just carried on doing since you were a kid?
Well, I've taken a few art classes in college, but not very many. Maybe I don't know, 3 or so over the course of my undergraduate degree, which was in biology. So I don't really have a formal background in art to any significant extent. I don't have any degrees in art or anything like that. Um, and I've never had any real formal education in scientific illustration or naturalistic illustration or whatever at all. So it's kind of just something I've developed through practice and learning on my own and learning from other artists who are much better and more experienced than me, and so on.
Okay, but as we're going to get into, there's a lot of science that goes into paleo art. Have you ever considered doing research or getting more involved in paleontology? Is there a crossover between what you're doing for your postdoc now and potentially something that you could do within the paleo realm? Are the transferable skills?
Well, I do think there are a lot of transferable skills that are kind of basic, like how to access and understand the scientific literature. Scientific literature in basically all fields of science have certain commonalities. Just how to write an academic paper, how to read an academic paper, how to understand statistical elements like significance thresholds and so on. Those things transfer over pretty well. And I have considered pursuing research in paleontology more directly, but I never really have. So if I got invited onto a project that involved research on some dinosaur taxa that I'm especially familiar with, I probably would want to do it, but I have not really tried to pursue it individually.
Okay, so have you ever been on any publication in paleo?
Um, I've never been a co-author on a paleo paper. Just an illustrator.
Oh, that's genuinely, that was a question that I didn't know the answer to, and I find that really surprising considering the amount of time and uh, understanding that has to go into drawing all of these dinosaurs and stuff. So, but yeah, it'd be great to have you on. So if anyone wants to invite Emily onto the paper.
Yeah, sure. I'd totally be open to that.
Right. So you've got your normal academic work. You've got your paleo art. What does a normal day actually look like for you? And a question I was thinking of as well is, given the pressures of academic research and being a postdoc and all of the time constraints that present, does that take a precedence over the art for you as something that is more time pressing?
Well, if my PI or coworkers are listening to this, I feel obligated to say that yes, of course, my postdoc research takes precedence. um, but the reality is that I actually felt more time pressure when I was like in my final 2 years or so of my PhD, because I had like kind of more constant obligation in terms of not just finishing my dissertation, but also meeting all of these deadlines, um, regarding, getting certain milestones through the program, I guess. And most significantly, teaching. I've been teaching for the past like 3 years or so, while I was finishing my PhD. Teaching takes a huge amount of time and energy, and it creates daily obligations that are not really negotiable. But as a postdoc, I do not have to teach, and so that actually gives me a lot more flexibility as to how I delegate my time. So a normal day, any given day, it really depends on whatever deadlines in either field are most pressing at the time. So, as you know, the over the past year, I have been working on my first solo book on Paleoart, and that involved meeting a deadline that was fairly cut and dry. So that was one of the most pressing deadlines. But at the moment, I don't have any significant deadlines for paleo work that I'm doing, although I'm going to have one soon. I'm doing a commission for a museum that has a kind of short turnover time. But so yeah, so the a typical day for me is just kind of prioritizing whatever project I'm working on that has some kind of deadline, um, that's coming up soonest. If that makes sense.
Yep. So would your PI ever, like come and sort of stand behind your shoulder expecting to see you doing your academic work and you're just there drawing dinosaurs? Because I know in my PhD, there was expectations of me to be doing research and I'm just there fiddling about with all paleocast stuff and social media, and it's just like, whoops, yeah, you caught me.
No, actually, my PI has been very supportive and understanding about my paleo work. He's actually writing a book about the evolutionary genetics of sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction that he's asked me to illustrate. So he's supportive, and also kind of finding that my ability to draw naturalistic subjects is useful to him as well. So he's always been kind of hands off, and just kind of letting me um, create my own motivation and work at my own pace, which I really appreciate.
Okay, great. So you mentioned your book, and that is called Drawing and Painting Dinosaurs, and it is published by the good people of, he looks at the book, You should know this off the top of your head.
Crowwood
I
Press.
find it.
Yes.
Yep, them. So what was your goal with this publication, and who is it written for?
Well, my goal with this book is kind of multifaceted, I suppose. First, Crowwood has also published Mark Witten's wonderful book on Paleo Art. And so one of the most important things with my book is to kind of make it different from his, so that, I'm not just retreading territory that's already been covered quite masterfully by Dr. Witten. And so his book is a lot more, I guess it's, I'm not sure how to put it. It's not very instructional in the sense of actually how to reconstruct animals. And he goes into a lot more detail about the history of paleo art, the evolution of technique and science and technology, and so on, and paleo art and paleontology. And so I wanted my book to be a little bit more, provide kind of more hands-on instruction, I guess, for people who are interested in learning about the actual work of recreating prehistoric life. And that in doing that, I try to make the book accessible both to, amateur or even professional paleoartists who already know a lot about this stuff, but they, might be interested in learning how I do things specifically, or, the specific things I focus on that might be of interest to them. But I also want it to be interesting and accessible to non-artists and to non-paleontologists, just people who are curious about scientific illustration in general, or are curious about dinosaurs in general. And so to that end, the one goal of the book is just to kind of explain certain complicated, both scientific and artistically complicated topics in a way that both laymen and professionals can understand and find interesting. So that was those two things together, kind of the motivation for the project.
So why do we draw and paint dinosaurs? Why is paleo art important?
Well, I would actually go so far as to say that paleo art is possibly the single most important category of scientific artwork out there, including naturalistic art of any types, because paleo art is a huge component of what drives people to be interested in dinosaurs and to care about dinosaurs. Paleo art, especially if you expand the definition of paleo art, which I do, any reconstruction of a prehistoric animal that involves some elements of creativity is paleo art, and that includes deciding what positions to put casts of bones into a skeletal reconstruction, either a diagram or actually a dinosaur skeleton in a museum. That's a type of paleo art. And so together with the reconstructions of dinosaurs that people look at in books, in museum murals and magazines, those reconstructions are really responsible for driving people into museums, I think. And, museum patronage is a huge component of what funds paleontological research. And so it's important, paleo art is important, not just in kind of esoteric or, theoretical terms, but also very much in realistic hands-on terms. It's responsible for generating money to research dinosaurs in large part. I also feel that paleo art kind of has a unique obligation to kind of engender a sense of wonder and appreciation for dinosaurs, and to try and get people, especially the general public and children, to think of dinosaurs as real animals, right? Because, dinosaurs were not movie monsters. So I guess in large part, kind of tongue in cheek, I would say paleo art is kind of obligated to undo some of the damage that things like Jurassic Park have done to the popular culture perspective on dinosaurs.
The way I like to think of it is that any single reconstruction or depiction of a prehistoric organism as a living thing is paleo art. Every single time we've seen a dinosaur recreated, that is a piece of paleo art. It includes some kind of interpretation. Is that correct, or are there other interpretations?
Well, a competing interpretation would be that every reconstruction of a dinosaur is paleo art if it at least attempts to be scientifically accurate. And so you would say that, a drawing of a dinosaur for something like the Land Before Time movies is probably not paleo art because, even though it might be informed by science, the goal of it is not to be accurate. It's to be cute and fun for kids and whatever. But it gets kind of into a gray area when you have a movie like the original Jurassic Park from 1993 that actually was quite science-based. It was by far the most science-based fictional dinosaur movie or anything on the big screen for its time. And it incorporated a lot of kind of new ideas from the dinosaur renaissance. It was the first attempt to depict theropods as intelligent, fast-moving, warm-blooded animals and not just plotting giant lizards. So you might say that that some of the dinosaurs in the first Jurassic Park film could kind of double as paleo art. I don't think you could claim the same for the Jurassic World movies quite as much.
Yeah, let's not get started with Jurassic World. Fun fact, I've never seen a Jurassic World film.
I saw the first one, but not the other two.
I've seen Jurassic Park twice, or maybe at a push 3 times. Jurassic Park 2 and 3 once each, and then that's it. I just don't find it interesting.
Yeah,
I don't like it. Yeah.
You're not missing much.
Yeah, I get that impression. I know what I'm like. I mean, you sit me in front of an Attenborough documentary and I'm just there raging the whole time, like, that's not right. Yeah, so sat in front of Jurassic Park, I can only imagine how annoying I would be sat next to. Yeah. Sorry for anyone that's watched Jurassic Park with me. Right. So in your book, you don't get into the specifics of how to actually draw dinosaurs. Despite the fact it's a book about drawing dinosaurs, you don't get into that until about chapter 5. So the first chapters are science, context, composition. How important are all of these in paleo art? And are they more important than how you actually draw a dinosaur?
I would say they're equally as important. And that's basically why I start the book with chapters about those things. I think that it's much easier to approach paleo art if you already have an understanding of how to read the scientific literature and how to interpret fossil data, how to interpret skeletal reconstructions, how to interpret comparative anatomy, and many other things, including evolutionary relationships. I describe the utility of phylogenetic bracketing in reconstructions of dinosaurs. And yeah, I think those things are really important as a basis for understanding how to approach an illustration of a dinosaur.
Okay, it's a good basis, but can it be done without due diligence to that context and the science of paleontology? Can you spot pieces of art that haven't taken all of that context into context?
Well, it's really hard to generate a piece of paleo art, including contemporaneous species, environment, foliage, and so on, and not and have everything literally 100% correct. I'm sure that a lot of my own work, it has tiny little inaccuracies that only a paleobotanist would spot, or and so on. But so I would say good paleo art can be done without an encyclopedic knowledge of everything that I talk about in the first few chapters. But I would say that the best paleo art does take these things into account. And if you approach paleo art without any significant understanding of the science that goes into it, then it's questionable whether it's really paleo art then, because you need to have certain understandings about how anatomy works, and how you know what the fossils say about what a given group of dinosaurs looked like, and what evolution would imply about the things that we don't know from fossil data, in order to have any kind of chance of making a semi-accurate piece of paleo art. So I would really say that both the artistic technique and motivation, and the scientific basis are necessary for great paleo art.
Do you think that well, I guess this is going to be incredibly subjective, but do you think that the mistakes in the context or composition of an artwork are easier to forgive or overlook than anatomical ones? So, for instance, you could have the most beautiful T-Rex hunting down and killing a Stegosaurus. It's in completely the wrong period. Those two didn't overlap. Or would you prefer to see something where, like a Tyrannosaurus is not doing anything that it would have been biologically capable of doing, like it's got its leg right up over its head or something like that, but it's there, trying to take down a Triceratops, and it's all the right plants in the background?
Yeah, that's a really hard question to answer. I think it kind of depends on the holistic value of the piece in question, um, and the context of it as well. So, for example, some of the paleo art greats of the past, like Charles Knight and so on, a lot of their artwork is not very anatomically accurate by today's standards. But if you look through a book of Charles Knight paintings, it's almost impossible not to be kind of moved by them, and how excellent they are in terms of not only the science at the time that he was working with, but also just the obvious artistic brilliance, the shading, the composition, the colors, the paint strokes. Um, but a really strongly artistic piece of paleo art today that doesn't incorporate any of the modern paleontological science would not be so effective. So I think that context determines what elements are easier to forgive or overlook, and I know that's kind of a cop out answer, but I don't think I can apply a blanket statement to that.
Sure. Would you find that the absolute best paleo artists are also good paleontologists at the same time?
Um, well, it depends on how you define paleontologist. If you define it as holding a PhD in paleontology, and running a lab and doing research in the field, I would say that there are relatively few great paleoartists who are actual paleontologists. Mark Whitten is one example. But I think they're kind of far and few between, or few and far between. Um, if you define
Or I guess maybe
paleontologist,
it's, yeah, someone that would pay attention to the paleontological science to inform their art. So not necessarily a publishing paleontologist.
well, yeah, I would say that most of the best paleo artists do have that level of understanding about paleontology. But I think it is also possible for great paleoartists um, to produce great paleo art just by kind of taking instructions from paleontologists and not really doing the research themselves, but just kind of being told what to do. And that symbiosis can definitely produce great paleo art, sometimes at least.
Okay, and I think the audience would be aware that paleontology is an incredibly huge field. It's basically biology multiplied by history through the context of geology. There's so much in it, and it's got everything from the anatomy of animals to biomechanics, ecology. Do you need to read across all of these subdisciplines? Do you need to have an understanding of them all in a way and incorporate elements of all of them into a piece of paleo art?
Well, I would say that you don't really need to have a background in all of those things, but you need to at least have a basic understanding of them. Um, that's a hard question, though. Um, I mean, there are a lot of aspects of geology, for example, that I don't know very much about. But when I start a new piece that requires some area of knowledge that I'm weak in, then I often have to spend hours reading about it and researching it, and sometimes asking questions to paleontologists in order to feel like I have a good footing to start the piece to begin with. But it's impossible to have an incredibly deep level of knowledge about absolutely everything that goes into paleontology and artwork.
Oh, of course. Yeah, it's just knowing to what kinds of questions you have to ask and stuff like that. That's the really important thing, and also a difficult thing to be across all of those things. So, anyway, in Paleoart, you make a statement with absolutely every stroke of the brush. So, if you are drawing feathers on top of a dromaeosaur, every single one of those feathers is a paleo ontological interpretation. So, where is the balance between scientific accuracy and artistic license?
Well, it depends a lot on the taxon that's being reconstructed. So, just for example, something like Microraptor, we know an incredible amount about Microraptor, not just how its bones were put together, but also the shapes of its feathers, the length of its feathers, and even its coloration, thanks to melanosome color studies. So for something like Microraptor, there isn't a whole lot of wiggle room in terms of the life appearance of the animal itself. For something like, gosh, I don't know, like Sciuromymus, for example, the baby so-called megalosaur, or some kind of theropod, we don't know. That's the holotype is the only specimen of that animal that we have at all. We have no idea what it looked like when it was an adult. So there's a lot more artistic license there. But even with something like Microraptor, if you have a huge amount of information about its life appearance, then you can pour the artistic creativity element into things like setting up a dynamic scene, showing it from an angle that you don't usually see in paleo art, showing it using its wings and tail in a manner that you don't typically see, but could still be plausible. You could, show it interacting with another dinosaur that it lived alongside that it may have interacted with, but that we have no idea for sure whether it did. So even if we know a huge amount about a certain kind of dinosaur, there's always room for artistic creativity and how you set up every other element of the scene.
How much room is there for paleoartists to make speculative depictions of dinosaur anatomy or behavior, is it their place to push the envelope with interpretations? Say, with our example of Microraptor, could you draw something speculative about its ecology, or should you just stick to what paleontology tells us?
I personally think that it's great when paleoartists make speculative predictions within the realm of science. I think that's one of the injunctions to Paleoart, actually, to try and make a statement about some plausible element of the animal's behavior or life appearance or whatever that may well be true. We don't know if it is yet, perhaps, but I think that speculative reconstructions can get people to think about the animal in a new way. Can maybe even sometimes inspire research to try and test the hypothesis that's depicted in the speculative piece of artwork. So again, using Microraptor as an example, we have probably dozens, if not hundreds, of unpublished and published specimens of Microraptor. At least 4 of them that I'm aware of include fossilized gut contents showing what it ate. And in all of these cases, they're totally different things. So in one of them, the gut contents reveal bones of a small bird. In another, they're a fish. And in another, they're a small mammal. And there's a 4th one too that I can't think of right now. But inspired by the seemingly very generalist feeding behavior of Microraptor, I actually made a speculative piece some number of years ago showing it eating the seeds of a cycad plant. And the idea being that Microraptor may well have been omnivorous. And, that conclusion is not just totally random. It's based on some comparative and evolutionary ideas, such as modern birds that fill a similar niche to Microraptor, like grackles and crows, are all kind of generalist omnivores. And also the specific shape of Microraptor's teeth they're a little bit different from the teeth of predatory theropods that appear to be obligate carnivores. And so putting these different things together, you can create a hypothesis that is disprovable, right? That's legitimate and informed by the available science, but still speculative. And I think that's one of the most fun things about Paleoart, is coming up with ideas like that. And I think that the whole All Yesterdays movement has gotten people to think about speculative reconstructions of dinosaurs in a lot more detail. And I think that's a net benefit to Paleoart and paleontology on the whole.
Can it not go too far, though? So I'm thinking of the case of Dilophosaurus and its frill and its spitting, and how pervasive and established that is in popular culture now. In every computer games, you've got a spitting Dilophosaurus. That is what is the public's concept of what that dinosaur was like.
Yeah, I do think it's too bad when a speculative element of a dinosaur reconstruction turns basically into a meme. That's kind of a different issue, but I do kind of dislike Paleoart memes, even ones that are relatively tame in terms of speculation, just because they kind of suppress creativity, just repeating the same speculative element over and over again. And when something very speculative, like the Dilophosaur frill, turns into a big enough of a meme, then laymen start to think that that's actually a science-based reconstruction, and they don't understand that it's speculative. And I do think that when memes get out of control like that, they can do harm to public perception of dinosaurs. Um,
But is
but
that more of a case of derivative artwork and the problems that creates, rather
yeah,
than the actual? Was there anything wrong with that speculation in the first place,
um,
per se?
I I don't know about the spitting part. That there might be some physiological issues with that. The frill itself is not impossible. If it were just one person out there who thought, this would be an interesting way to show that, soft tissue in dinosaurs might be a lot more elaborate than the fossils would suggest, which is a true thing to say. Um, it'd be fine to just make a single reconstruction like that. The problem with memes and speculative reconstructions is that, an artist can never really predict when a meme, when a speculative depiction is going to turn into a meme, and then the downstream effects of that on public perception can sometimes be harmful. So there's kind of an unknown about how much that speculation is going to catch on in the general public, and that can be a problem sometimes.
Okay, I'm feeling ready to put pen to paper now. So, where do you actually begin? Is there a universal starting point with your artwork, or does each individual piece or organism have its own rules, its own approach?
Um, that I would say that depends a lot on the purpose of whatever the piece is. Um, Sometimes I just like to sketch out ideas just for fun and see if something sticks. If I'm working on something important, like a commission for a museum or a book or something, a lot of the time, the first stage of the process is at least a day's worth of research and reading. um, about not just if I'm not familiar with the dinosaur intimately, then I'll have to read about its fossils, look at its skeleton, look at its photographs of fossils, and then if it's an environmental piece, then I have to also read about the geologic formation in which it was found, read about the environment um, of that formation. Was it a swampland? Was it like a floodplain? Was it arid? And so on. And then also to read about the other dinosaurs that may have lived alongside it, and so on. Um, so yeah, I would say research is almost always the starting point for me when it comes to a serious piece. Once I have a sense of what I want the composition to depict, then I'll start sketching out thumbnails and trying to set up a scene that's interesting and accurate.
Okay, but in terms of the actual anatomy and the actual process of drawing the dinosaur itself, do you always start off with the trunk? Do you position the head first? Or again, does it just depend on what you're drawing?
I guess now that I'm thinking about it, I do tend to start positioning the head first before I do anything else, because the head is often the focal point of the piece. You want the viewer's eye to be drawn to the animal's eye in many cases. So getting the head set up is often the first step, and then trying to position the body is sometimes a long process where I try to avoid just two-dimensional flat positioning because it's kind of boring to look at. But getting the anatomy correct at unusual angles can often be quite a challenge. And it usually requires a lot of revision and trying different ideas before I get something I like.
So, what are some of the easiest and hardest dinosaurs to draw? I imagine something like uh, an apatosaur or something with a big long neck all bending around in 3 dimensions would be harder to draw than something like a T-Rex with no feathers.
Well, for me, the easiness of a given dinosaur is highly dependent on how much practice I have with that kind of dinosaur. So I find dromaeosaurs easiest to draw simply because I have drawn them the most by far. um, so practice and familiarity has a very large effect on how easy a given dinosaur is to draw. But apart from that, there are like I actually think T-Rex is kind of difficult to draw too, at least from three-dimensional angles, in part because its head, its skull, has a very distinct shape, and it's not always intuitive what that shape would look like if it were rotated at a certain angle. Sauropods I also find difficult to draw. Actually, one good example of a dinosaur I always find difficult to draw is Stegosaurus and other Stegosaurians, because getting the plates to work visually from different angles is a kind of a three-dimensional puzzle challenge quite often. And getting the lighting correct on complicated large structures, like what is the position of the cast shadows on the different plates of a stegosaur, that can be extremely difficult to do sometimes.
Here's a business idea. You know those little wooden marionette things that artists have to draw? Could we make them for all the different taxa of dinosaurs?
That's a great idea. And actually, Creative Beast Studios is kind of trying to do that. They make these series of very finely articulated plastic dinosaur toys, and they did a line of dromaeosaurs first, and then they're working on tyrannosaurs and ceratopsians, I believe. I think they're done with the ceratopsians and moving on to tyrannosaurs. Those models are very useful. They have dozens of articulation points. They come with a little stand that you can position it on, and you can bend the tail around, and you can put the feet in different positions, and the head and the jaw. So yeah, that's probably the best thing we have in this respect at this point.
Are there any easy ways of getting around problematic anatomy? And what I'm thinking of is lots of feathers and lots of fat. So a seal would be really hard to draw its anatomy of, but you'd just be like, okay, it's a fluffy ball now. And maybe a bird as well, a robin or something. It's just like, okay, now it's a ball of feathers. Is there a similar way of using that to get ahead in paleo art? Just like, we don't need to draw all of this dromaeosaur. Now it's just a big ball of feathers.
Well, one short, I don't know if you'd really call this a shortcut, but it definitely is useful, is if you're drawing feathers, if you want to draw a lot of feathers that are, kind of casting complicated shadows on one another, then referencing bird photography is a huge benefit to doing that. Even when the feathered dinosaur doesn't have advanced feathers, it's still really useful to look at photographs of birds that are like maybe in the same position to see how the sheets of feathers fold over one another, and to see how the shadows of the feathers are cast on one another. If birds did not exist, or if birds all went extinct and we don't have any photographs of them, drawing dromaeosaurs would be a lot harder than it is. And for drawing lots of fat, like if you're trying to like draw the folds of skin that would have connected like the thigh to the belly of a sauropod or something like that, then referencing how rhinoceros skin or elephant skin looks can also be very useful to get those details right.
So you've said that your favorite, or at least the group of dinosaurs that you're most experienced with, are the dromaeosaurs. Do you have a favorite piece of art that you've produced?
One of my favorites is a depiction of Microraptor that I did for a team of paleontologists that actually discovered the gut contents of the fish inside the Microraptor. And that illustration was produced for the journal Evolution to go alongside the article. And that's one of my favorite pieces that I've done of dromaeosaur, of any dromaeosaurs, in part because of the amount of research from different sources that I was able to incorporate into that single depiction. The coloration of Microraptor, the position and length of its feathers, the fact that it was eating a fish, even the way that it's holding the fish was inspired by Denver Fowler's raptor prey restraint paper. And then elements of the background incorporate plants and features of the environment that we know from fossil data. And yeah, I had a huge amount of fun with that piece, and I still like it, even though it's kind of old now.
For every single picture that's in your book, how many half-finished sketches do you have?
I have hundreds and hundreds of unfinished sketches. For a given piece, it varies a lot. A lot of the time when I'm working it digitally, I'll just kind of like redraw parts of the sketch and erase parts of the sketch just many, many times. But yeah, I do have a lot of unfinished sketches just kind of lying around. So yeah, I often go through a lot of those before I'm happy with something.
Do you have a favorite paleo artist? And if so, why?
Yeah, I have a lot of favorite paleo artists, but I think the single paleo artist that I could unequivocally call my very favorite is Douglas Henderson, and he's just an absolute master. I think he's the best paleo artist since Charles Knight. He combines environmental and anatomical accuracy with just an extraordinary artistic talent. His ability to set compositions up compellingly, and his ability to create an atmosphere that makes you actually feel something, I think is just extraordinary. And I think very few other paleo artists have come close to accomplishing quite what he does.
So earlier we said about some of the issues that derivative paleo art creates. Do you find that a lot of paleo art is derivative? Do you begin to recognize certain poses or colorations or memes, as you say, in the field?
Yeah, there is a lot of derivative paleo art out there. There are certain color schemes for dinosaurs that have become really popular and just continue being used by people. When people are, especially when like amateur paleo artists are starting a reconstruction and they're just typing it into Google and they see a bunch of different Stegosaurus artworks that all have like a kind of orangey pink body and green plates, or maybe it's the other way around. That really proliferates, and sometimes it's hard to avoid that. I'm sure I've fallen prey to derivative paleo art from time to time, especially with taxa that I'm not extremely familiar with. I think that the current younger generation of paleo artists is kind of moving away from that. At least they seem to be at the moment, and people are trying new things and speculative coloration patterns and stuff like that. It's quite refreshing to see the new generation coming up with new stuff.
Have you ever had any of your art plagiarized that you've seen?
I have. I think it happens to every professional paleo artist from time to time. I've never seen my own art plagiarized in a context that was really upsetting. It tends to be like kids. I can think of one example from a few years ago where it was just some kid who was making these composites out of a bunch of people's paleo art and then pretending that it was his. And that kind of thing is annoying, but honestly, I don't know. I feel like you have to choose your battles when it comes to this kind of stuff. And, kids on the internet, that's not usually a battle that I care too much to fight. Occasionally, I do come across companies online selling like, T-shirts and tote bags and stuff with artwork that's been ripped off from me and others, and that's a little bit more annoying because they're getting some trickle of revenue from it. But usually they're easy to issue takedown requests to their parent company or their ISP or whatever. So it's not usually that big of a deal.
Okay, so thinking about how to create new and unique and non-derivative paleo art, and considering your academic background, could we design an experiment to have some identical twins create some paleo art without the context of ever having seen a reconstructed dinosaur before? What do you think that would look like?
That's an excellent question. And one of my future goals is to try and study the genetic and environmental bases to drawing technique. I suspect that if pairs of identical twins have really never seen reconstructions of a certain kind of dinosaur, they would probably do it pretty similarly. The problem with studying artwork in experimental psychology is that nobody's really come up with a good way to quantify or measure the components of it. So that's kind of a big setback to that kind of research. But I have thought about this before. I've designed some preliminary pilot tests, and I hope to actually do something with it someday. Maybe not with paleo art specifically, but with art in general.
That is very interesting. It was a very flippant remark, but it's fantastic that you're actually thinking about that.
Yeah.
I think all of my experimental designs are rather unethical. I don't think they'd pass the ethics committee.
Yeah.
Right. But having read your book from cover to cover, how would I start to sell my artwork now? So where do your commissions come from? How do you market your talent to potential clients? Or is it that they come to you?
Yeah. Now, when I was first starting out as a professional paleo artist and I was starting to become somewhat well known, my strategy was often to be a little bit more aggressive in marketing myself. And so I used to when a new dinosaur had just been published and was getting covered by news agencies for the first time, I would often email a bunch of these different media companies and ask them if they would, pay me to reconstruct an illustration for their articles, and sometimes that was successful. Nowadays, I don't really do that so much because I don't have time for that kind of thing. And so nowadays, I kind of just let people come to me for the most part. And in terms of commissions, that works out pretty well because I get about as many requests as I have time for. I have had other book projects that I've worked on with co-authors where it's been a huge struggle to find an agent or a publisher that's willing to pick it up. The contract with Crowwood for my recent book kind of just came out of nowhere. I guess Mark Whitten recommended me to them because he'd published with them before and they were interested, and it took off. But finding a publisher for an existing project idea can be extremely hard, even for relatively well-known people.
Is it nice to find that commission in your inbox?
Yeah, it is. It depends a lot on what the request is, and I do have to turn them down sometimes. But if somebody wants, if somebody just finds me and wants me to do something that is really fun for me, then I do enjoy it a lot.
Do you get commissions that offer, some really great exposure, but no money?
Sometimes.
I bet that's fun.
Yeah, I have mixed feelings about that. I think a lot of paleoartists would say that they find it really disrespectful and insulting, which is fair. in my case, sometimes I'm willing to do it anyway if the cause is something I care about. Like, I've had a lot of people who work with kids who, you know, they don't have enough money to pay me very much, but they really would appreciate it if I did some dinosaur drawings for an article in a kids magazine or like a kids book. I worked on a kids book a while ago for very little compensation. So I think educating the public and especially children about dinosaurs is important enough to me personally that sometimes I'm willing to do stuff for so-called exposure, but usually just that kind of thing. I'm not usually willing to do it for other causes.
I just had a revelation in that I'm not actually paying you to be here. You've been on for an hour and 20 minutes or something talking to me now. Are you doing it all for the exposure for your book?
No, this is something I enjoy doing interviews and podcasts, and I appreciate the opportunity. It's never something I would expect payment for.
Good. So we've now all bought your book and are interested in drawing dinosaurs as well. Does the world need more dinosaur art and dinosaur artists?
Yeah, I would say yes. There's always a place for new artists, even if it's just sharing their work online. There are thriving online communities that love to see new art. I always love to see up and coming young paleoartists getting really good and sharing their work online. When it comes to professional jobs in paleoart, there is kind of a finite number of those available. And so, whenever I'm asked about this, I don't really enthusiastically encourage people to devote their entire career to making a living in paleoart because it's such a small area and the demand for it is not high enough to support everybody. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
And what would be the single most important piece of advice you could give anyone starting from scratch?
Practice. Ask questions to paleontologists or to communities online, and read as much as you can. Read the research, read dinosaur books, read Wikipedia. Wikipedia is great for dinosaur articles, not so great for other things, but it's great for paleo stuff. And practice. Nothing beats practice when it comes to getting good at any type of art. And also to have fun with it. Don't think of it as a chore. Do it if you enjoy it, and do what you enjoy.
And if anyone is interested in getting a copy of this book, where would they find it?
The book is available from Crowood's website at crowood.com, but it's also on Amazon. It's £18.99. It's only available in hard copy in the UK right now, but the US release is planned for May, this upcoming May. It's also available for Kindle for everyone all over the world. So you can just go right onto Amazon and type in Drawing and Painting Dinosaurs, and it'll come right up.
Okay, well, Emily, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's been great.
Paleocast was brought to you by Dave Marshall and Liz Martin Silverstone, with contributions from Tom Fletcher, Vish Venkat, and Elsa Pancharoli. Music was composed by Patrick Kendall Smith. Paleocast was made possible by funding from the Paleontological Society and the Paleontological Association, but the show now relies on funding from you, the listeners. So, if you've liked this episode, please consider donating, and thanks to everyone that's helped out so far. Please visit paleocast.com for the supplementary material to this episode and for our archive of past programs, and follow us across social media platforms to get all the latest news. Finally, if you enjoy our podcast, then please explore all of our video content on YouTube and follow our other projects, the Virtual Natural History Museum and the Paleocast Gaming Network.